All right, because so many of you asked for it, because 3 of you asked for it, I'm going to do a 1 year later review of the HOTAS and Throttle that I did last year. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how it has survived after a year of fairly hardcore use. But first, Jimmy. In and of itself, the stick is still extremely comfortable, it's very easy to use, and all of the good things that I said last time. I think the only thing that I will say that I found negative with it, or that's perhaps not survived, is the bottom of the stick. This little hand rest kind of has become a bit wobbly over time. It hasn't detached, it hasn't impeded my gameplay in any way, shape or form, but when you get your hand onto it, it does sort of wriggle a little bit and become a bit unstable. Other than that, this stick is exactly as originally reviewed, everything works perfectly. I guess the only issue is with Elite Dangerous's most recent updates with all the different button combinations and different screens that you can go into and stuff, this does start to suffer with its limitations in that you have to use some of these buttons to access those screens. And again, you can't see them if you're playing in VR, which generally I am. Having said that, I haven't actually mapped all the buttons yet, and I'm able to do every single function that I could ever possibly want to do in ED. Now last time we talked about the orange light that comes on when you move the stick. One person helpfully suggested if you put black tape around it, you probably wouldn't see it. If you're very fancy, you could 3D print a little cover over the top of it, I don't know. But in VR, it hasn't bothered me at all because obviously I don't see it. And as far as the throttle is concerned, nothing's broken on it. Everything works still exactly as expected. After the last video, I wrote a little annotation that there is actually a loosening screw underneath so that the slide, which I was complaining about, can be loosened. Having said that though, it does still catch, even in its loosest form at the moment. You could make it move with gravity, but even so, it still is actually catchy if you wanted to make micro adjustments, albeit you probably don't. You're going full throttle, stopping, going backwards. So I did find and in fact use this lube here. It's called the Servosol Electrical Clean and Lube. I've pretty much squirted it in once or twice, so there's a rail that the throttle actually runs on. So I've squirted along that rail a couple of times, moved it back and forth. It seems to have done the job. My biggest gripe about the system last time was the use of the targeting or the target software, which you have to use to set this thing up to begin with. But I haven't actually had to touch it since. So once you set it up the first time, it seems to just be as good as gold. Once you've got it working the first time, don't ever open up the targeting software, the target software, whatever it's called, ever again, and you'll be fine. But it did kind of scare me off, and I've seen a few of your comments from the previous video, and it certainly has scared some of you off. I haven't touched the target software ever since. And if I had to, I would probably be throwing this stuff in the bin as well, so I get your frustrations. So I've used this setup on a number of different games, Elite Dangerous being the primary one, Microsoft Flight Simulator probably being the other. For either of those, it works extremely well. I'm sure it works just as well in the other systems. Flight Simulator is a bit finicky in that you have to drop down and select the 2 different controllers individually to map their different buttons and settings, but again, once you've got it set it up, you don't have to touch it again. So the 10,000 subscriber question really is this still the best HOTAS for Elite Dangerous? Sort of. You remember the premise of the previous video was that it's not the cheapy one and it's not the super expensive one. I'm playing in virtual reality most of the time, which means that I can't see the buttons anyway. So having a Warthog or something with more buttons and switches would just make it harder for me to find them. Just the stick itself in the Warthog configuration is nearly triple the price of these 2 things together. So generally what I've done is I've mapped some of the functions to these hat switches. So the top one I use for my different panels that I look at, the center one I've reserved for selecting targets and switching modes, and the bottom one I've got for fighter control. So forward is attack, backwards is, dock back with the ship, and a few other bits and bobs like that. And for ED, the rudder I'm simply using to move between menu items. So it's not being used as a rudder, it is in flight sims, but not in ED because the joystick again has its twist rudder, which works phenomenally well. I guess the only bit that I still haven't found a use for is the twisty trim controller, which is very useful in flight sims, but again in ED doesn't actually do a whole lot. But I still haven't answered my question, is it still the best HOTAS for Elite Dangerous? For a mid-range HOTAS, it does everything that you need to do. For the fact that I'm wearing VR, I'd love these buttons to be more tactile or to be switches. Really, it's about the feel, and when you're in VR, this feels like the throttle that is represented on screen, this feels like the stick that is represented on screen, and it mirrors the movements perfectly. So, for my money, it definitely meets the spec, and it does the job admirably. So thank you so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind subscribing, that's the only thing that YouTube actually gives two hoots about for creators these days, so that would really help me out. And I hope you have a great day and fly safe, Commanders.